and welcome back to the Hannah Frankman podcast. On today's episode, I want to talk about the TikTok ban. I want to talk about whether or not TikTok is harming our young people, and I want to talk about whether or not kids should be on social media at all. In case you haven't been following the news or you are blissfully disconnected from the TikTok world, I will catch you up very quickly. In April of 2024, then President Joe Biden signed legislation requiring that TikTok's parent company ByteDance either sell TikTok to a US-based owner or cease operations in the United States. That legislation went into effect last week, and because TikTok had not sold to a US-based owner, it was required to cease operations in the US and remove its app from the American App Store. In his first days in office, President Trump signed an executive order that extended TikTok's runway by another 75 days to either find a U.S. owner while continuing operations in the U.S., and if a deal could not be reached, then remove their app again from the App Store. So we've been left in this sort of limbo where TikTok was removed from the App Store. It's technically back, but it may only be back for a limited window of time before it is once again removed, this time permanently. And this has led to a lot of interesting conversations about the effects of losing TikTok, which is one of our largest social media platforms. The US has about 170 million TikTok users, which is almost 65 million more people on TikTok in America than on Twitter. And it's only 20 million fewer users than Facebook has, which means it is one of our largest platforms. And quite a few of those users are young people. Gen Z is chronically online, and Generation Alpha, honestly, at this point, is not far behind them. And for young people, TikTok is the social media platform of choice. And there have been many conversations over the years about the effects of social media on young people and whether or not it's a good thing for young people to be on social media platforms. And TikTok has always been at the center of those conversations. And this is one of the most frequent questions that I get asked when I'm on Twitter or when I am doing a guest appearance on a podcast. People want to know how I think about young people in social media and my advice for parents on social media usage. And it's something that I honestly don't talk about a lot because it's complicated. I don't have a singular piece of advice that applies to every single parent. But I do think that there are important arguments that are made on both sides, both the people who are vehemently against young people being on social media and the people who think that social media does serve a purpose and is a net positive for young people. And I think that if you're thinking about whether or not your kids should be exposed to social media, you need to take both sides into consideration as you're thinking about what decision to make for your kids. But there's also the broader cultural implication of what is social media doing to us. And with TikTok being the primary mechanism for social media usage for our young people, I think the TikTok conversation is really important. So we're going to dig in first to the arguments about why young people should not go near social media at all. And then we're going to steelman the argument that TikTok is in fact a good thing. And then we'll break down how to actually make a determination for your kids and also how to discern what sort of effect social media is having on yourself. So last year, Jonathan Haidt, a prominent social psychologist, published a book called The Anxious Generation that dissected the effects of social media on our young people. This book went viral. It was talked about everywhere. And there were a couple really important arguments that it made that I personally think are hard to refute. One of them is that social media is designed to amplify things that are emotionally engaging, that are polarizing, that are controversial, and that provoke outrage and fear and envy in its users. And as someone who spends a lot of time on social media, both writing my own content and also for work, I know this is true. the way the social media algorithm is designed is to keep people on platform. And what that means is that the algorithm, out of all of the content that everyone is creating and publishing, it's looking for the things that it thinks are most sensational and most interesting and most controversial to put in front of people, because that's what keeps people engaging on a platform. And the last thing the platform wants is for people to leave the platform, because the longer eyes stay on the platform, the more ads the platform can put in front of those people, the more ad revenue is being collected, and the more the app's business model is working. The downside of this, besides the fact that it makes social media addictive and keeps people on the platform longer than is perhaps healthy for them to be there, is that social media distorts people's perception of the actual climate of the world around them. If you were to go on Twitter, for example, the day after the election or the day of the inauguration, for all intents and purposes, you would think that one half of the political aisle, half of the country, was ready to go at the throats of the other half of the country. It felt like the world was a pressure cooker, with both sides so furious at each other that it was ready to explode. But if you put down your phone and you went outside almost anywhere in the country, the feeling would be very different. And you would realize that for the most part, people on opposite sides of the political aisle were very peacefully interacting with each other. In many cases, we're still friends. And the world was a much calmer and more reasonable place than it feels on the internet. But because the algorithm preys on people's emotions and plays up the sensationalism of what's happening, the algorithm is giving you a very distorted view of what's actually happening in reality. And the same is true in every vertical, not just politics. This is one of the reasons that social media so often gets blamed for young women's depression and anxiety and self-esteem issues. The algorithm is promoting the most beautiful women in the entire world and making young girls think that that's the beauty standard that they need to live up to. And if they have a facial structure or a bone structure or a body composition that doesn't align with that perceived ideal, they start to believe that they're not beautiful and they can never measure up, even if they're perfectly beautiful and are perhaps even one of the most beautiful girls in their geographic locality. They won't know it because they think that the beauty standard that they have to measure up to is a Victoria's Secret model. Jonathan Haidt argued that social media is one of the primary drivers of our mental health crisis in our adolescence, particularly in young girls. He points to the increases of depression and anxiety and self-harm that coincide with the rise of smartphones and social media platforms, and argues that there's a direct link between social media's sensationalism and distorted view of reality and the loneliness and the anxiety and the social comparison of its young users. Of course, there's also all of the arguments about cyberbullying and social media harassment and predatory behaviors of people going on social media platforms and catfishing or pretending to make friendships with young girls who really they have negative intentions towards. There are all kinds of arguments for why social media is deeply harmful for young people. There's a tweet that also went viral the day that the TikTok ban went into place last week. It was from a former TikTok employee named Armand, who said, "I worked at TikTok for the past 2 years. It's getting banned tomorrow. Ask me anything." And someone commented and said, "Would you let your high school age children use TikTok?" And Armand replied, "Hardest no possible." And I think that's also very telling. If someone who is in the weeds inside the company building the product would not let their own child use the product, that's a pretty good indicator that other parents should probably follow suit, because he's able to see under the hood how the platform is being designed and how it's incentivized and how it's incentivizing its users. And I think that's something one needs to at least take into consideration. On the flip side, there are the arguments in favor of young people using social media platforms, both as platforms for learning and also as mechanisms for building. And I think these arguments also have merit, and this also needs to be taken into consideration. One of my favorite pieces on this was written by Austin Scholar, who is a 19-year-old Substacker. She was a student in the founding class at Alpha, the innovative school here in Austin, Texas, and she's now a freshman at Stanford University. And last year, she wrote an article about the value of TikTok and why she doesn't think that parents should limit the screen time of their kids for social media platforms. In this article, Austin talks about how she used to be a TikTok skeptic. She thought she was too good for the platform. She didn't want to waste her time on it. But her friends were using it and were creating content, and she wanted to be a supportive friend. So she created an account specifically to watch her friends' videos, but for nothing else. She wasn't going to scroll the platform. She wasn't going to get caught in the doom scroll. She was going to go like her friends' videos and log off again. But she said that the algorithm started feeding her things that were very related to the content she was interested in. And she realized that she was actually learning things off of TikTok. And she started scrolling on the platform and being fed more videos based on what content she was liking and what she was spending time watching. And her takeaway was that the algorithm was actually very good at feeding her things that she was going to find useful, and that TikTok was actually a valuable platform for information consumption. Her argument was that TikTok does have dangerous content. It does have time-consuming and time-wasting content, and that it is possible to fall into the trap of just comparing yourself to all of the TikTok filters and thinking that your reflection in the mirror isn't beautiful enough compared to those. And that if you're just spending your time on TikTok getting a dopamine rush by scrolling through quick, punchy, entertaining videos, then it can be extremely addicting and is probably bad for you. And you're experiencing what the internet calls brain rot. But she felt that when she was paying attention to the valuable content on TikTok and was training the algorithm to feed her that content, she was actually getting a lot of value from the platform. And her friends were on TikTok because they were building accounts as creators and were building followings that were eventually allowing them to start businesses or land podcast appearances or build their brands as content creators for future professional endeavors. And all of those things are valuable. And I have seen time and again examples of young people using social media in very positive and constructive ways. Grace Price is a phenomenal example. She was also a student at Alpha School, and her capstone project at the school was to build a documentary on cancer as a foodborne illness. She wrote, directed, and produced a documentary in which she interviewed some of the world's leading health experts and talked about the research that links cancer to diet. And she released that documentary on Twitter, and the documentary went viral. And it was the kickstart to her career in health commentary. And because of the content she produced, she was invited to speak at a panel at the US Senate this fall. And she was invited to attend the Maha inaugural ball, this past week's presidential inauguration, whichever side of the political aisle you fall on. That's a pretty great testament to using social media in a constructive manner to further your career. Another example of this, and probably my favorite example of all time, is Cole Summers, the 14-year-old rancher in Utah who used Twitter to build his personal brand and promote and launch the autobiography that he was writing about his very unconventional school experience. He was using Twitter very intentionally to document his journey as an unschooler and talk about his ranch and the business he was building and his writing. And he used it to land opportunities writing and publishing for other platforms and to promote and sell his book. And this is a very clear-cut example of social media being valuable to young people when they're using it constructively. And I think this is really the crux of how you need to think about social media usage and kids. The TikTok algorithm is a very powerful tool when it's being used as a tool. When it's using you, you're left sitting on the couch for hours on end, scrolling through 15-second video after 15-second video designed to give you a dopamine hit and make you feel like you're doing something entertaining, even though you're really learning nothing at all and will probably forget almost everything that you've seen by the time you stand up again. And the internet has given this behavior a name because it is so common. They call it rotting on the couch. And when you're using TikTok rotting on the couch, the platform's really using you. You're the eyes, you're the product, you're the eyes that are viewing the content that ads are being put in front of. But when you're using TikTok constructively or any other platform, as a creator, you're putting content out into the world, and suddenly it's becoming a powerful tool for you because it's getting you reach without gatekeepers. A young person can go put content on the internet and not need anyone else's permission to publish it. And if that content is good and people demonstrate that they like it, the algorithm will pick it up and put it in front of new people. And that young person can build an audience, and they can also test their ideas. They can put things out onto the internet and see if the internet thinks it's a good idea or an interesting take, or if the internet thinks it's wrong. They can develop their own thinking by testing ideas in real time and getting immediate real world feedback. And for a young person who is motivated to build an audience or create a brand or sell a product or sharpen their skills as a thinker, this can be incredibly valuable. And I think the reason this issue is so complicated and why people get so fired up in opposing directions is because both of these things can be true. If you're using social media primarily as a consumer, it is very easy to get sucked down into the abyss of outrage bait and emotional content that draws you in and leaves you feeling fearful or angry or envious or lacking in self-esteem or like you don't measure up. And the algorithm is designed in a way where that is an easy place for your child to end up. And let's be real, your child is in the early stages of having a whole human experience, and sitting on the couch for hours a day scrolling on an app is not really the pinnacle of having a human experience. And there's a reason why education models like Montessori, for example, place such a heavy emphasis on habit formation from a very early age. It's because your habits are the foundation of everything else you're going to do in your life and the way that you're going to approach your life. And building a habit of defaulting to sitting on your phone and scrolling every time you're bored or anxious or uncomfortable or just have downtime is really detrimental to your long-term productivity, your long-term attention span, and arguably your long-term intelligence. But on the flip side, if you are using social media as a creator, it can also be a really powerful tool to connect with an audience of people who might find your ideas valuable or interesting and who can become your customers in an entrepreneurial venture, or who can become the audience that helps you hone your thinking skills and perhaps jumpstart your career. And so in a world where both of these things are simultaneously true, it can become very complicated to figure out which one is more important. And I think a lot of it comes down to the culture with which your kid is engaging with social media. And I think this culture question extends beyond just social media and into almost every aspect of their lives. Is your kid developing their wiring to be a consumer, or are they developing their wiring to be a creator? Most people on social media are consumers. Most people in the world are consumers. Most people sit down and watch movies without ever writing a script of their own. Most people read novels without ever writing a manuscript of their own. Most people read articles or tweets without ever writing something themselves. And some forms of content consumption are more valuable than others. And sitting and reading a book might be a net positive on your life, but sitting and watching a TikTok video probably isn't. But in every aspect of their lives, if you hope to raise agentic, self-directed, driven, accomplished children, having the habit of being a creator and not just a consumer is going to be incredibly important for their long-term success and arguably their long-term happiness. The argument for social media usage is much stronger if it's being made from a place of enabling creation and not just consumption. But even then, I would argue that that creation ought to be purposeful. If your child has a private Instagram account and they're sharing with a small group of friends pictures of their travels or their craft projects or their art or their day-to-day, that can serve like a journal, and that can be a beneficial way for them to connect with their friends. But if they start getting pulled into an algorithm of For You pages and viral content, it can very quickly devolve into something that is addictive and time-consuming and distracting them from the other things that would actually be valuable uses of their time. And so I think if your child is using social media, it should be a deliberate decision that is built around a specific intent. It's very easy for parents to feel like they need to be peer pressured into letting their kids use social media because all of their friends are on it and their kids feel left out if they're not using it. And parents feel like the bad cop for limiting their kids' access to something that all of their friends have. But I think some of this can be overcome with really deliberate and agreed upon usage parameters and usage purpose. But in general, I personally would be very leery of letting my kids on social media too early. And I would be very leery of letting them on social media without any agreed upon parameters. This doesn't mean rules. This doesn't mean hard and fast, dictatorial, you have to use it this way or else it's being taken away again. But it does mean being honest with your kids about the potential upsides and downsides and making sure you feel like they're ready to use it responsibly and not let it take over their lives. And I think the longer you can hold out from letting your kids on social media, the better. I don't think you're a bad parent if you let your 14 or 15-year-old start using Instagram or TikTok. But I do think a 14 or 15-year-old being allowed to scroll indefinitely without any encouragement to do anything else and allowing themselves and their character and their personality and their worldview to be shaped by what the algorithm is feeding them is a very dangerous thing and is not serving them. I remember when I first got social media, I was 18 years old. And actually, I was 17, but I was very close to turning 18. And I convinced my parents that I was ready to have a Facebook. And at first, it was a very benign thing. I was posting a few things on social media and I was logging on occasion and seeing what my friends were posting. But the more I used it and the more I got sucked into the doom scroll of my feed, the more it started to detract away from the other things I could have been spending my time on, and the more I felt it affecting my perception of the world and my mental health. Not in a dramatic sense, but in the sense that I would be a little less happy or a little less energized or a little less inspired when I got off the app than I would have been if I hadn't been on it. And even that minuscule effect was very scary to me. But I was old enough to know the difference between what it felt like to be on the app and what it felt like to not be on the app. And I think that was really important. Part of the reason I don't have a super clear-cut answer when parents ask me whether or not I think kids should be allowed on social media is because I think there isn't a super clear-cut answer. It's similar to when parents ask me what schools I recommend, and I don't have a singular answer. So much of it hinges on the specifics of the child, the circumstance, the personality, the other things going on in their lives. And in the same way, I think social media usage, the specifics of it hinge on the child. I think that in general, there's a maturity question that comes into play. There's a purpose question that very much comes into play. But I would generally advocate for younger teenagers to be kept away from social media as long as possible, and for older teenagers to be exposed to the idea that it can be a net positive if they're using it constructively to learn about things they're interested in and to create content that's valuable to them, and to make sure they have a really real understanding of how addictive the For You page and the algorithm can be. Is going to be interesting to see whether or not the TikTok ban goes through, or whether or not TikTok does sell to a US-based company. It certainly is going to make a dramatic difference in the day-to-day lives of young people if TikTok does indeed get banned in 73 days now, I think is how much we have left. But the question's broader than TikTok, because young people are on Instagram, they're on Twitter, they're on Facebook, I think, a little bit, not very much anymore. They're on YouTube, which also has an algorithmic functionality, so it's sort of doing the same thing. And I think at the end of the day, how young people are engaging with social media platforms does have a huge impact on how they engage with the rest of their lives. And I think in most cases, it's probably a net negative. And it's something that parents should be very deliberate about in introducing to their kids, but also supporting their kids through, helping them learn how to navigate a platform so that the platform doesn't consume them the way it's quite honestly designed to do. All right, that's all for this week. I would love to know what you think about this. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Do you agree? Do you disagree? How did you handle this with your kids? And I will see you next week. Same time, same place. Thanks, everybody.